Mass protests in Israel forced the government to put a temporary hold on a controversial plan to reform the judiciary. What happens next? Hello, I'm Mike Walter, sitting in for Anna Naidu, and this is The Heat. For months, hundreds of thousands of Israelis have been taking to the streets across the country to protest what they say are far-reaching changes to Israel's judicial system that threatens the country's democratic foundations. The reforms were first announced 3 months ago after the formation of Israel's new far-right government led by Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. CGTN's Stephanie Fried has more from Tel Aviv.
It's been a few days since Israel experienced one of the most tumultuous 24-hour periods in the country's history, and it may seem like things are now calmer. But the cracks in the veneer attributed to the government's proposed radical changes to Israel's judicial system are expanding, even though Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu put a freeze on controversial plans to avert civil war. The latest fallout, U.S.-Israel relations. For the sake of preserving those ties, President Joe Biden is openly urging Prime Minister Netanyahu to rein in his government's proposed legal overhaul, characterized as a threat to democracy. The government's judicial reconstruction plan will give Netanyahu's coalition override or enactment powers on court decisions and laws and control over appointing judges. The plan's architects say it encompasses legal reforms critical to reining in a biased court system. Critics warn it erodes checks and balances, dials back human rights laws, and fosters government cronyism and corruption. The overhaul plan was introduced days after Benjamin Netanyahu formed the most extreme right-wing coalition in Israel's history. Coalition partners include ministers previously convicted of anti-Arab violence and tax fraud. Netanyahu himself is currently on trial for corruption. The judicial redo is perceived as a legal workaround designed to keep him from serving jail time if he's convicted. Fears over dangerous overhaul fallout have sparked months-long nationwide protests and calls from foreign investors, business and tech industry leaders, Nobel Prize laureates, political allies, top military reservists, and former heads of Mossad and the defense industry for the government to moderate or scrap the changes. When earlier this week, Israel's defense minister urged the government to pause plans due to tangible overhaul-linked security threats, Netanyahu sacked him. Outraged Israelis responded by hitting the streets, calling a nationwide labor strike, shutting hospitals, universities, and schools, grounding outgoing flights, and demanding a judicial overhaul halt. Netanyahu agreed to pause legislative moves to end the crisis and negotiate a moderated judicial plan with government opposition members, but many are skeptical, saying they don't believe Netanyahu. Protesters say it's too late. They now want him and his government out. The overhaul suspension ends in a month. Stephanie Fried, CGTN, Tel Aviv.
There is a lot to talk about. Let's get right to our panel. Amotz Asa-El is a senior commentator with the Jerusalem Post. Moien Odeh is an ethnic Arab citizen of Israel and a human rights and international law attorney. Also with us is Ariel Kahana. He's the senior diplomatic commentator for the Israeli newspaper Israel Hayom. And Simcha Rothman serves as chair of the Knesset Constitution Law and Justice Committee. He's one of the lead architects of the government's judicial reform proposal. And we're going to start with our first question to him. As I pointed out, you're one of the leading architects of this proposal. You said hitting the brakes is a mistake, so maybe you can go into detail why you think that is. And what are some of the problems you hope to address with this measure?
I think that hitting the brake is a mistake because I don't think the dispute or the riots that are happening in Israel are about the judicial reform. It's about the delegitimization by members of the opposition and some people on the street to the elected government of Israel, and therefore stopping for negotiation on the judicial reform that wasn't the problem to begin with won't solve this problem. And I think that the responses that we got already for the offer or the stop that the Prime Minister declared on shows that that was the case. Some of the opposition leaders said it very loud and clear by themselves. Some of the protest leaders said it loud and clear by themselves. So you should listen to the people. If they shout that they don't want you in government, you can't just say, "Oh, it's just a problem with the judicial reform."
Let me just ask about a poll that was taken recently in February by the Israel Democracy Institute. Only a minority of Israelis support these reforms in that poll. The vast majority, 72%, want a compromise to be reached, even those, 2/3 of them think the Supreme Court should have the power to strike down laws. 63% of Israelis think the current method of appointing judges should stay the way it is. So what would you say to those who argue, look, the vast majority of people aren't in favor of this measure, and the protests that we're seeing are an indication of that?
I have to say that quoting the Israeli Democratic Institute polls as a source is like I will tell you that I have a poll. They are side in this political debate just like any other side. They are not an independent polling organization or even not a source of usual polls on this issue. The Israeli Democratic Institute has a skin in the game by themselves. They have an agenda. It's okay. It's legitimate. But the polls are heavily biased. I think that other polls in Israel, and especially the most important poll in Israel, the elections that were held just 3 months ago, were very clear about the judicial reform and the need for the judicial reform. And people who try to obstruct the will of the public in Israel are inventing polls to do so.
Okay, so you disagree with the polls, but let me ask you about the earlier question I asked, which is, what is this measure designed to do?
So I think that changing the Israeli system. By the way, the detailed polls today say that the vast majority of the public in Israel understands that there is a desperate need for a change in the judicial system. That data is widely agreed on. And the fact that people want to do it with agreements, you can count me in also. I also like it to be with agreements. The problem is that the opposition until now weren't available for any agreements. They just delegitimized this government. But I think that the second we will return the justice to the justice system in Israel, and we will allow the public in Israel to have a say who are the judges, just like any other democratic country around the world, I think we will do justice to the public in Israel and to the justice system.
Amotz, he says the public should have a say. It seems like they do have a say out on the streets. We're seeing just immense protests. What do we read into those?
Well, first of all, I want to correct Mr. Rothman and say that no one is disputing the election results. This is not what this is about, unlike what you suggest. This is not about who won the election. This is about how constitutional change is done. The legislation that you are leading is about constitutional change. It is, for instance, about how Supreme Court justices are selected or elected, and it's about how or what the Supreme Court's mandate should be. These are weighty constitutional questions. Constitutions, by definition, are supposed to reflect the broad consensus and to foster it. What you're doing does not reflect the broad consensus. It reflects a very narrow majority, and in fact, rather than foster the consensus, it fractures it. This is my problem.
Well, Amotz, let me ask you about what the Prime Minister had to say. Netanyahu saying that there's an extreme minority tearing Israel to shreds. He says he won't allow the country to descend into civil war. He went into much more detail. I want to get your thoughts on what he had to say. In your recent column, you said that in the Jerusalem Post, you said his retreat will be like Napoleon's from Russia. Give me a sense of why you think that is, and also respond to what he's been saying about this.
Because what we have been presented with, a sudden and broad and sweeping constitutional change, is the political equivalent of Napoleon invading Russia militarily. Obviously, there's no analogy in that regard, fortunately. But in terms of the size of the pretension, this is what we're discussing. And this is not how you do constitutional change. And that is why, for the first time in decades, so many Israelis took to the streets spontaneously. No one organized them. Unlike what the government suggests, nobody paid for this, certainly no foreign power, as has been alleged. This was spontaneous. And this shouldn't have happened as far as he's concerned. And that is why once it did happen, he was at a loss to explain it. And he resorted to his usual tactic in such situations, which is to change the subject.
Ariel, he says he's prepared to negotiate with the opposition. Israeli opposition leader Yair Lapid has talked about the potential for a compromise, but there seems to be a trust deficit. So what are your thoughts on that? Is there a possibility that there can be some kind of consensus on this?
Hello, Mike, and thanks for having me in your show. It's good to be back. I think, Mike, first and foremost, if I may say, that as an Israeli citizen and as an Israeli journalist, if I'm going to a question, what we definitely saw in the last weeks, which were and still are very hard for Israeli society, we saw a very strong Israeli democracy from both sides, and no one doubts it. I mean, there were huge demonstrations, and, you know, it's not obvious to say the government made no try to stop the demonstrations. And, you know, in the world, I mean, in non-democratic regimes, you can see such efforts by the government. So it's very important to say that Israel from all sides, so there's no question that Israel was and is and will be a democracy. Now, the question is how, as Amotz described, and that was definitely and still is under disagreements. Now, going to the compromise option, so there is a huge mistrust between the sides. It's politics. It's a lot of, I would say, bad history between the sides. You have to remember, we just had elections which the right wing won after 5 tries, after 5 rounds of elections, and a deep political crisis that took place for almost 4 years. So everything is very tense. As I said again, people do not trust, do not believe one each other, not in the public and not in the government level. So the process will have to be, I would say, very gentle, very slow, I guess. And first and foremost, the sides will have to believe one each other. Now, you mentioned Yair Lapid, the head of the opposition. I think the current government believes him less than another opposition leader, which is former secretary, former security minister, and that is Benny Gantz. He is now very strong in the polls, and it seems that he may be an opposition leader that the government can make a deal with.
Moien, let me ask you about these proposed judicial reforms. How might they impact Palestinians and Arabs in Israel? And what is your sense of the road forward?
Yeah. Thank you. Actually, let's keep in mind that millions of Palestinians in the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem are suffering from this total disconnect from the being able to vote, from being able to do anything towards the policies that were happening to them for tens of years now. Now what's happening is that Israel, the Israeli government, is taking what they did for the Palestinians for years, and they decided to do it internally. For sure, this will affect a lot of the Palestinians, citizens of Israel. This will put them more and more to the side, back to the wall, and this will brought them away, much more away from the government, from the policies that the government is doing. The whole idea, unfortunately, is just to make a dictatorship now. Netanyahu wants to save himself for the corruptions case that he's facing, and the whole idea is just to save, to be away, and to keep his coalition partners happy. Doesn't matter what is the price. Palestinians paid a huge price for years, and they will keep paying now. What's happening is that the Israeli government decided to take the policies in the West Bank and to start to implement some of it inside Israel. So the Israelis start to understand what was what the Palestinians suffered for years.
May I reply
Okay,
to that?
sure,
To
absolutely.
what Moien just said?
Yes.
So I think first of all, we have to remember that there are no elections in the Palestinian Authority for many years, since 2006. And the reason for that is not Israel. It's because Mahmoud Abbas, the chairman of the Palestinian Authority, decided not to have elections. If it was depend on Israel, Israel would support definitely elections. The problem is, everybody knows, if the Palestinians will go to elections, a terrorist regime like we have in Gaza, a Hamas regime will be elected, and nobody wants that. It's important to say. So if we talk about a dictatorship, that's what goes on in the Palestinian Authority since 2006, because Mahmoud Abbas was elected for 4 years. It's now 2023, and he's still in office.
All right, Moien, I'll give you a quick chance to respond to that, and then we got to move on.
First of all, this is not 100% correct. First of all, Israel refused to give the Palestinians the right to vote in East Jerusalem. This is one. Two, let's keep in mind that many criminals and even convicted criminals are elected and now serving in the Israeli government. So you cannot decide for the Palestinians who want they to vote for and who want they elect. I think the world accepted and respected the results in the in Israel in the last year, and they accepted Ben Gvir and Smotrich to be ministers there, although they are convicted criminals and they have very, very extreme views. So keep this in mind.
Please, before you ask me this question, can the previous speaker talk about what exactly what criminal charges Smotrich was convicted on?
He was, I don't exactly remember, but he was part of.
You don't exactly remember. I suggest,
you can check exactly
that if you don't exactly remember something, please don't tell it, especially if you don't remember lies. It's not very dignified way to speak. You're sure? So please be sure in the data. Please be sure in what you say. I suggest you be pretty sure before you allege that someone was criminally convicted. Please tell the audience that watches you what was the criminal conviction.
I can check now. I can check. Give me some time.
All right. Well, I'll tell you what. We can get back to that right now, but I do want to get back to this measure, and I want to get to the response from U.S. President Joe Biden, who's also weighed in on this. He had a very contentious phone call with Benjamin Netanyahu. He also said this publicly. Let's watch.
Like many strong supporters of Israel, I'm very concerned. And I'm concerned that they get this straight. They cannot continue down this road. And I've sort of made that clear. Hopefully the Prime Minister will act in a way that he's going to try to work out some genuine compromise, but that remains to be seen.
So, Simcha, I want to get your response to that. And what's this doing to the relationship between the United States and Israel, do you think?
First, I'm still curious. What exactly conviction are we talking about?
All right. Well, we've already kind of gone down that path, and he's already explained. But I do want to get your response to what Joe Biden had to say.
But you know why it's important? Because that's exactly the kind of lies that's going around the world, spreaded by people or irresponsible people, just like the one spoke before me, telling lies, and then just, okay, let's go over it. No problem, no harm done. The fact that the person can say such lie on TV, and then, okay, no, I don't really know what I'm talking about. That's the problem Israel is facing, especially about the judicial reform. And I will return to what Biden has just said. So President Biden, of course, I'm sure, I haven't checked it, but I'm sure he didn't have time to go over the legislation in Israel. It's actually, he even shouldn't do that, because it's an internal Israeli issue. It should be decided by the citizens of Israel, like any other democratic country in the world. And what he knows about this issue is what people in the news, in his office, tells him about it, and he knows the truth, that some people in Israel are very worried because of the new government. And if you check, and again, the person who spoke even before that said that no one is talking against the Prime Minister or the government, but again, and it's spontaneous demonstration against the judicial reform. During this interview, I checked the spontaneous websites organized, telling everyone where is the next demonstration, where is the buses you can get to it, where is the data, or very spontaneous. And I also checked Ehud Barak, previous Prime Minister of Israel, one of the leaders of the riots and the revolt, and he says what we need to do is to take Netanyahu down. This is our goal. This is what we need to reach. So everything is not organized, of course. So so the reality is very clear. Those demonstrations are organized. They're organized for a political reason. Their goal is to take down the government, not to stop the judicial reform. And if I am wrong, it's a question why the leaders of the riots said specifically that they're not stopping, even though the plan has stopped and there is negotiation going in the president's house. So I think the people who spoke before me, besides Ariel, had to explain a lot about the difference between the reality and what they said.
Amotz, I'll give you a chance to do that. I also want to get your response to what Joe Biden had to say.
Well, first of all, unlike what Mr. Rodman suggests, the President of the United States is very well briefed about what's going on generally in countries in the world, and particularly in Israel. And I think he is quite familiar with what he is discussing when it comes to Israel. And don't delude yourself, Mr. Rodman. America is very angry, and with good reason. And it's very concerned and very anxious. And so are this critical mass of Israeli society. They're livid. And if you delude yourself that someone organized us and somebody micromanaged us and pulled the strings. Wait a second. I did not interfere in what you said. Please don't interfere with what I say. The events in Tel Aviv in the hours immediately following the preposterous dismissal of Defense Minister Yoav Gallant were spontaneous. Nobody organized that. It was midnight. There was no buses. There was nothing. It was people pouring out into the streets, not only in Tel Aviv, but throughout the country, because the move was so crazy for the Prime Minister to fire Israel's defense minister merely for the alleged crime of having spoken his mind and said that what is happening in Israeli society in general, within the army in particular, is threatening Israel's security. For him to say that,
said nothing about the judicial reform.
Let me finish what I have to say. This is why people took to the streets and nobody organized them. Is there, on top of that, some organization now that there is momentum? Of course there is. There was also organization in the government, and the demonstrations that the government organized. Yes, there is some organization. The government did not organize any demonstration. You see, you are telling lies. No, listen to me carefully, because
okay, let him finish and then you can respond.
The reason people are in the streets is not because people organize them, but because they're angry, first of all. Secondly, why are they angry? They're angry because constitutional change is being done while they are being ignored. Thirdly, they're angry because the people who are being ignored are the people who are creating Israel's wealth and success, the middle class. And the
first class.
Just let him finish and then I'll give you a chance to respond. I really will.
Unlike you, Simcha Rothman, I'm an officer in the Israeli army. I spent years in the army and in reserve duty. I deserve at least as much clout as the 25% people in your coalition who did not serve in the army and represent the people who dodged the draft and in fact want this constitutional change that you're doing in order to impose on us, the Israelis who do serve in the army, your exemptions from military service for ultra-Orthodox men. This is the problem. Address it.
Okay, thank you. I have to say, I couldn't say it better. It has nothing to do with the judicial reform. The second you talk about the ultra-Orthodox draft law, a problem that is about 30 years old, that many governments tried to solve, and the Supreme Court blocked the solutions, even the solution by Yesh Atid party. This is not about the judicial reform. It's about you and your friends thinking that you are a first-class citizen. That's what you think. You look down at the ultra-Orthodox. You look down at me, apparently. I don't know why, even though I served in the army, but doesn't matter. You look down at anyone else, and then you complain that people say it's not about the judicial reform. It's about the fact that you think that you have.
I didn't serve. I said you weren't an officer. I was.
You need to have more power in government than your vote in the voting booth. That's a problem with democracy. That's the reason why people went out maybe on the streets, and that's the reason why in 10 hours, people came out spontaneously
you don't do
to the street.
Constitutional change with a narrow majority.
It has
Do that with a
nothing
broad
to do
consensus.
with the constitutional change. And I have to tell you that if President Biden is well briefed on the change, he would never say anything because he knows how the judges are elected in the U.S. Judges are elected in the U.S. by the party, by his party. He can elect the judges.
Because they have a bicameral system and they have a constitution. They have checks and balances.
I don't want to get, gentlemen, I don't want to get bogged down with an argument here. I would like to direct a question to Ariel. The crisis appears to have hurt the Prime Minister's popularity. In recent polls, it shows the Likud party, its support dwindling. I want to ask, is this controversy hurting Israel's stature as the only democratic country in the Middle East and a regional economic powerhouse, do you think?
So regarding the democratic type or character of Israel, there is no question, as I said before, about that. I think it's quite clear if you see such huge demonstrations and free discussion as we have here in this show, very tense, very hot, like your show, the heat, right? So it's very emotional as well, but still it is completely 100% democratic, and that's very good, of course. Now, regarding the economic shape of Israel, Mike, I believe for the long run, if stability in Israel will not come back, if a compromise will not be found, if the instability will keep going on, that might be problematic for the long run. We do see the numbers in some aspects going down a little bit. So I think it's also an economic interest of Israel to settle this problem peacefully, by a compromise, by a consensus. I think the vast majority of Israelis, like the polls you quoted, vast majority of Israelis wants to solve this problem peacefully.
Moien, do you see this as a possibility that the government could unravel as a result of this yet again?
I'm not sure 100%, but I think it might happen soon because according to the news, many of the Likud members are not happy with Netanyahu. They want him to talk with the opposition, with the others. But again, he's pushed very hard by his personal interest, by his court case, and this might put him again with a conflict with his own party. But again, this might also be a good opportunity for everyone to rethink about what's happened for everyone, and let's put everything on the table and to rethink about everything, including the peace process with the Palestinians, including with the occupation of the West Bank and East Jerusalem. So this might be a good opportunity for the whole world to see what's happening here and to put more and more pressure on the Israeli government for real talks and to end this occupation now or forever.
All right, we're going to have to end it there. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us. It's been a great discussion, and that is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Mike Walter in Washington, D.C. Thanks so much for watching.